Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you're joining us from the United States. My name is Byron Russell, and I'll be moderating the panel discussion today. This is Block.co's 6th live webcast. Block's parentage can be traced back to the University of Nicosia, a thought leader in blockchain technologies, and in fact, the first university to experiment with the deployment of blockchain technologies in issuing academic certificates. Today, Block.co is a pioneer in application for blockchain credentialing. As a company, its mission is also to raise awareness about the latest blockchain technology developments, as well as industry trends and new opportunities. This afternoon, we're going to be looking at blockchain solutions for book and journal publishing and dealing with issues of concern, such as intellectual property rights. It's a great opportunity for everyone working in the publishing sector and for anyone interested in innovative solutions which can be applied, for example, to registering and guarding intellectual property. After the session, everybody on the webcast is going to receive a self-verifiable certificate of attendance anchored on the blockchain and powered by Block.co's open source solution, which will be a great opportunity for everyone here to see how the process works in practice. We aim to leave around 10 minutes for Q&A after the main discussion. Please put your questions in the Q&A box and we'll answer them in rotation. If we run out of time and there are any questions that we can't answer, which either need more research or more thought, we'll get back to you with a reply from the Block.co team and our speakers. Finally, the session will end with 2 polls. One to have feedback on the session itself, and the second to assess what other topics might be of general interest to all those coming along today. Each poll will take less than a minute or so to complete, and we'll announce the results before signing off. So let's get started. I'd like to begin by introducing our panel today. We have Alexis Nicolaou, Chief Executive Officer of Block.co, who'll be able to tell us more about blockchain itself. We have publishing technology expert Phill Jones, who has worked in the past with disruptors and innovators in the sector such as digital science, and is now Director for Digital and Technology at the MoreBrains cooperative. And our publications expert today is Tappuni, who I've had the pleasure of working with in the past, and who is now Business Development Lead at Pottermore Publishing, managing the highly complex web of digital rights behind the Harry Potter publishing phenomenon. So first questions, I think, go to Alexi. There'll be a lot of people on the webcast who are new to blockchain or relatively unfamiliar with blockchain and what it does, and are here to learn how blockchain can actually be applied to their own needs within the publishing sector. So put very simply, what is blockchain? And how does it differ from a common database?
Thank you, Byron. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have everyone here at Block.co's 6th webcast, aiming every time to shed some light on how blockchain technology, this nascent technology, can actually add value to specific industries. Reply to your question, Byron. A blockchain is a type of a distributed ledger or decentralized database that keeps continuously updated digital records of who owns what. Rather than having a central administrator like a traditional database, for example, one held within a publishing house or society or association, a distributed ledger has a network of replicated database which are synchronized via the internet and visible to anyone with access rights within that network. Now, a lot of people tend to confuse blockchain with Bitcoin. Bitcoin was simply the first known application of blockchain technology in 2009 with the publication of its white paper by a person going by the name of Satoshi Nakamoto. Since then, applications of the technology have been implemented, amongst others, in the supply chain industry, government, insurance, intellectual property rights, and a number of others. The two most important differences between blockchains and centralized databases can be characterized in the following terms. Disintermediation is number one. Blockchains enable multiple parties who do not fully trust each other to safely and directly share a single database without requiring any trusted intermediary like a government or a registrar or some kind of other authority. The second one is confidentiality. All participants in a blockchain see all information about the transactions that are actually taking place on that blockchain. Even if we use pseudonymous addresses and advanced cryptography to hide some aspects of those transactions, a blockchain will always leak more information than a centralized database. In other words, blockchains are ideal for shared databases in which every user is able to read everything, but no single user controls who can write what. By contrast, in traditional database, a single entity exerts control over all the read and write operations, while other users are entirely subject to that entity's whims. To sum it up in one sentence, blockchains represent a trade-off in which disintermediation is gained at the cost of confidentiality. In answer to your question.
Oh, thanks very much. I think that's put it fairly succinctly, especially that last sentence, which really kind of summed it up. What do you think the benefits, the main benefits of blockchain compared to centralized systems? You've outlined some of them already. You've outlined the features of confidentiality, for example, and the fact that where trust may be an issue, which obviously is the case in something like copyright or in the case of Bitcoin. What else would you say are the main benefits of blockchain compared to, say, centralized systems? What are the main benefits of a distributed ledger system?
There was a recent survey, actually, and the number of professionals that participated were asked that question, and the two most important ones that were highlighted by that they were within the community, within the blockchain. They were actually using blockchain technology themselves in their businesses. The two top ones were transparency and immutability. No matter what kind of a transaction takes place using the blockchain, the complete transaction history is shared with every peer included in the network. In fact, singular documentation is allotted with all the details in this distributed ledger system, making transparency its peak point amongst its advantages. That also means that for changing a single transaction record would require the permission of the entire network, and thus the data on the blockchain is more accurate and more consistent, supporting the quality of immutability. Reliability was also cited as a benefit in that particular survey. Very intentional blockchain development is to be secure and stable. And such characteristics are rare, particularly in a mobile application that is in high demand among various businesses. The reliable nature of the blockchain implies that it is reasonable for a wide assortment of users, from chronicle business and financial transactions to filling in as a platform for record stockpiling and everything in the middle. Any application that needs to store substantial volumes of information can conceivably profit from the reliability that is offered by blockchain technology. Other benefits, adjacent benefits, would be those of decentralization, for example. The one simple fact that the users don't have to put their trust in a central authority is indeed a game changer when it comes to this technology. It eliminates the chances of your data getting sold, for example, to other parties, and I'm sure everybody's been witnessing such occurrences, and it prevents single points of failure. That implies a single node of the network going down cannot bring down the whole system. So regardless of what number of users arrive and leave into the network, your applications stay up and running. Other less important advantages I will highlight as reductions in cost, security, increased security, and no intermediaries, so no automation.
I think the reliability is there. Sorry, was Phill saying something then? No, okay. I think the whole issue of reliability is an extremely important one. I mean, I remember from my own days working back when one of the companies I worked with did not use cloud storage, for example, and the systems went down, and a great deal of data was nearly lost, actually, despite having backups. Obviously, no system is perfect. So, what are the limitations of blockchain to keep in mind? What would you say are the restrictions on usage?
Obviously, it does, like any technology, it does come with limitations. Two of the critical disadvantages, I will call them, of blockchain are, first of all, the unsustainable consensus mechanisms, which are inherent within a blockchain. And as a second one, I would rank the limited scalability of them. Basically, the blockchain is based on a distributed ledger technology, forming a peer-to-peer system with no central authorities, as I've already said. This does create a system that is devoid of corruption from a single source, but the blockchain challenge of making faster decisions persists in these cases. The consensus mechanism was integrated into the blockchain development to achieve a dynamic agreement and benefit the whole group of the stakeholders involved, considering the majority of votes as the final settlement. But this concept also has the drawback of involving a slower process. Second major blockchain, which is, as I said, limited scalability. Best examples for this issue can be explained by unveiling two of the major blockchains out there, that of the Bitcoin and Ethereum. Both of these cryptocurrencies, because there's cryptocurrency powering these networks, use blocks for a transaction process, and these blocks are limited to a particular size, and hence only a limited number of transactions per block can be performed. As a result, Bitcoin can handle 3 to 4 transactions per second. Ethereum can handle 15 of the same. This clearly enforces the restricted status quo of the blockchain technology and the need for some improvement. Some other limitations I will highlight as being storage constraints, access to external data, which, however, can now be resolved through the introduction of the so-called oracles, and redundancy is one of the disadvantages that has been mentioned at times.
Just a quick question. Are there any practical limits to storage?
That, you mean as far as the, well, applications like blockhosts are actually built as second layer on top of blockchains. So our limitations as to storage depend on the servers we use to power the transactions. The blockchain itself is limitless. There's blocks added all the time. So if you don't make it into the last block, you make it into the subsequent one. And it all depends on the price you're willing to pay for getting your transaction within that particular block. The miners that actually choose which transactions to insert into specific blocks usually pick out the ones that offer the highest return, and the higher the demand, like in any industry, the higher the cost of transactions. Now that we're in fact going through a bit of a bull market in cryptocurrencies, the transaction costs have in fact risen quite significantly.
Thanks very much. I think now we turn to Phill, actually, and we move over more towards publishing as an industry. And publishing as an industry is notoriously conservative. They're a bit reluctant as far as change is concerned, depending on the publisher, of course, but particularly in the field of trade publishing, they can be extremely conservative. So, Phill, turning to you, you've had considerable experience in introducing and implementing new technologies into publishing, many of which have been extremely successful and have been taken up over the past few years. So, in your view, how can new technology be best introduced to the publications industry?
Right, indeed, yeah. So my name's Phill Jones, and as Byron said, I'm co-founder for digital and technology at MoreBrains Cooperative, and we're a group of specialist consultants working with a variety of organizations involved in scholarly communication workflows, open research infrastructure, and publishing tech. My background specifically is somewhat circuitous. I started off as an academic researcher. My PhD is in atomic and plasma physics. But I spent 6 years at Harvard Medical School as a biophysicist before jumping into the commercial sector, where I joined a startup publisher called Jove as their first editorial director. So I did that because as an academic, I had become somewhat frustrated by perverse incentives that I felt prevented researchers like myself doing the best work that we could. So since then, I've mostly worked in the scholarly publishing industry with a broader interest in open research and infrastructure. I spent some, as Byron said, 6 years at Digital Science, doing a variety of different positions. I was the CTO at Emerald for a short while. And so I come to this panel not as a blockchain expert. Well, I know the kind of the broad strokes of what blockchain is and what it does, some of the use cases it's currently being applied to. My interest here is more sort of connected with the challenges and opportunities associated with new tech and new innovations, particularly in industries like publishing, where there are some unique and interesting challenges. So speaking of one of those challenges, I think one really interesting aspect of the publishing industry is that it has benefited from extremely high barriers to disruption, particularly the scholarly publishing industry. It's actually pretty remarkable that it still exists largely in the form that it has done for centuries, despite many attempts to disrupt it and innovate around it. So the web itself was invented, for example, by Tim Berners-Lee as a means to improve dissemination of scientific information, which in other words is disrupt scholarly publishing. Andreessen Horowitz famously said that software is eating the world to describe how information technology, particularly via the web, has disrupted every industry it has touched, except for scholarly publishing. So the second edge to that particular sword is that those same things that protect the industry, which are the third-party payer mechanism, the network effects around academic prestige, evaluation and reward, risk aversion inside institutions themselves, has traditionally reduced the need for innovation amongst publishers. To make an analogy to evolutionary theory, it seems sometimes that publishers are a little bit like a species of small tropical bird, on an island that has yet to evolve any sharp teeth or big claws or anything to protect itself. So to stretch that analogy a little bit, there's this sort of risk, I think, that at some point a European explorer will show up with a cargo hold that's got rats in it, and our niche evolved tropical bird that is academic publishing will be in a little bit of trouble. So arguably efforts like Sci-Hub represent the first warnings that this is still possible. So I personally rather avoid that sort of disruptive event, and that might be a risk to the scholarly record itself. It would be better for publishers to be part of and to take a leadership role in reinvigorating scholarly comms through various types of technology and innovation. So how do publishers do that without just throwing away their existing revenue streams? So if you're a large multinational like Elsevier, Springer Nature, or Wiley, there's a well-trodden path, a tried and tested strategy that has been used in other industries, and you can call that innovation at the edge. So a large, well-funded company with legacy business models and processes can either invest in startups and small innovative companies and adjacencies, or create their own sandbox that is isolated and protected from the big machine to develop those innovative ideas. If and when those new ideas work, resources can be diverted to grow those new ideas and shift the focus of the business over time. There's been some really good and effective approaches to that in our industry, and people have had some success doing that, particularly changing content companies slowly over time into more service-oriented organizations. So for a small organization, however, like a learned society, it's a lot harder because many of them are working with small number of staff, fairly thin margins, and a limited number of products, often only 1 or 2 journals that are generating revenue. So in those instances, there is strength in co-opetition, not cooperation or competition, but the hybrid of the two, co-opetition. And that is organizations can band together through things like trade associations or create new organizations to enable them to share risk of innovation between partners. People like ALPS and SSP, as well as service providers like Crossref and Orchid and so on, can be very helpful here, as well as some of the newer initiatives that we see, like SOC PC is a great example. That's society publishers getting together to, as I say, spread risk and do innovation together. So a specific interest of MoreBrains is how to create those types of collaborative organizations. We recently wrote an article actually published in the January 2021 issue of Learned Publishing, which is free to read if anyone wants to go chase it down and have a look at it. And we did 2 case studies in that, Crossref and the UK National PID Consortium, that discuss how cooperative governance structures and risk sharing is an evolving area of business. So the big challenge with innovative and disruptive tech is often that when it first appears, its use cases are not necessarily obvious to business leaders. But I think that if you work together to share the risk of innovation and experiment and develop things together through co-opetition, it's possible to spread that load, to spread that risk, and allow those new innovations and those new models and new ideas to kind of surface over time.
Thanks very much. I think one of the big problems as well is, a lot of the society publishers, particularly the smaller ones and the university presses, are time poor and staff poor. So
yeah.
you look, for example, at the University of Huddersfield Press. For a long time, that just had 1 person running it. Now I think they've got 2. So when you've only got a very, very small number of people actually operating everything from production to content editing to peer review, how can publishers best learn about new technologies that may benefit from them, and how can they pick and choose between the new technologies that are emerging?
Yeah, and that's very difficult, isn't it? So it's not always obvious which are the technologies that are going to be useful. I'm sure many folks on this webinar have sat in conference talks and various webinars, and they've been told about all sorts of different technologies that promise to massively change the world. But at the end of the day, how do you know what's going to deliver, particularly if you've not necessarily got anybody in-house who's able to demonstrate or be able to pick apart and understand and triage various initiatives and ideas to see what's going to be useful for your business or for your organization or whatever it is that you do. Many of the use cases for innovations they're not clear when technologies first emerge. Like a good example might be the iPhone, right? So when that was launched, a lot of people sort of laughed at how they thought it was a combined mobile phone and an MP3 player. Why would anybody want to do that? But today, most professionals can't live without one. So these technologies, they start off being one thing and they grow into something else, and it's really hard sometimes to predict, unless you're Steve Jobs and you have this, remarkable ability to identify technology. For the rest of us, how do we avoid it being a bit of a crapshoot? So the challenge, or one of the challenges around this, I think, is that often people selling a technology are the people who are explaining its value. So you'll see in conferences, sometimes you have like the lightning talks around the innovation stuff right at the end of the conference, and you have the startup founders come up and explain it, right? And that's great. The marketplace of ideas is a fantastic thing, but what it's missing is enough third-party dispassionate evaluation. There's missing enough of a layer of people who can explain these technologies and contextualize it and try to bridge the gap between those business problems and those organizational problems and the potential of the technology. So what we need is sort of trusted explainers that aren't selling specific tech, that can help publishers and other organizations understand how they can solve their individual or shared business needs, business problems.
That's very interesting. So intermediaries who can actually contextualize what the new technology might be able to achieve and who the publishers themselves will trust. Because
Yes.
otherwise, who's going to trust the salesman? Well, we know about that, don't we? So, for example, we talked earlier about the iPhone and how that transitioned from being a rather strange kind of thing, which was neither a phone nor a radio nor a camera, but a combination of all of those, and has now become the indispensable part of everybody's daily life. So within publishing, it used to be argued that tech innovations such as artificial intelligence, altmetrics, alternative metrics, were solutions in search of a problem as far as publishing is concerned. Although many of those new technologies, AI being one case in point, have now generated enthusiastic adoption. So as a technical expert and from the technical point of view, how would you rate blockchain technology as a solution to a problem? We've talked about what it can do, but as a solution, how would you rate it?
Yeah. So I think that most people are familiar with the Gartner hype cycle, which I think is quite informative in this sense. It's this idea that when something new comes along, a lot of people get very excited and think it's going to change everything. And at some point, when it doesn't sort of materialize into this world-changing event, people become disappointed and disillusioned, and they start to think it was all hype and it's all nonsense and it's not good for anything. And then eventually it sort of levels out and people develop a realistic understanding of the value of the tech. And I think with blockchain, we're at the point where we have just sort of passed through that sort of peak of the hype cycle, and people are now asking, is this really a thing? Is this a solution that's in search of a problem, or is this going to be doing anything useful in the future? So in other words, we tend to overestimate the short-term impact of technology and underestimate its long-term value. So you mentioned AI, that's the classic example, right? Many products and services that we use today that leverage AI and sometimes machine learning aren't referred to as AI products. So mapping and route finding tools are used in the travel industry. Some of the more advanced grammar and writing tools use AI technology, recommendation and summarization, auto transcription. They're all products that don't feel the need to boast about their underlying tech because they solve the actual problem. So they're selling a solution to the problem, not the technology stack that lies underneath it. And I think that's a really important way to tell the difference. So I heard somebody say just the other week that if somebody says something about blockchain, the first thing to do is take away the word blockchain from the description and add the word database. And if it's still exciting, then it's worth paying attention to. So just remove the concept of the technology to it in your own head to assess its value. So at the end of the day, blockchain it's a database technology with a specific set of characteristics, as Alexis explained. From a practical perspective, what that actually means is that once it's set up, it does not require an organization to act as the gatekeeper. There's no need for somebody to act as a police force to ensure the integrity of the database because it's self-correcting. So what that does mean, the downside of that, if you like, is that changing the structure of that database is not as simple as it might be for other types of databases, like a SQL database or document database or a knowledge graph. So blockchain acts as this sort of ledger, if you like, allowing any authorized person to read the data and then to add another event to the end of the chain, which is why it was used for its obvious first use, which was transactions in cryptocurrencies, and why now it's being used in things like rights management, which is what Jane's going to talk about. So is there something in scholarly publishing or scholarly communications that would really lend itself to that type of database? That's the question we need to ask. So I personally see possibilities around things like version management of outputs, papers and data sets, protecting the integrity of data sets, especially in areas that are targets for bad actors. And I'm thinking about things like environmental science. It might be useful for protecting the integrity of academic CVs, or for fighting predatory publishers, and for other types of high value, high risk information resources. And I think that's the place where we kind of have to look for the applications of it. So what I would say, I think, is that blockchain already has uses in other industries. So it's not, a technology in search of a problem. It will have successful uses in our own technology, but it's not going to solve everything. There are other types of databases which are better suited to other types of problems. The question is, what are the specific problems that this will be a good solution for?
So a question of tailoring the solution to the problem that you actually have.
Yes, rather than sort of going the other way around and having a great technology and wondering what you can do with it.
Yeah. And of course, it is at the forefront of everybody's mind now at the moment. I mean, the number of emails that I've been getting regarding Bitcoin, which is the immediate correlation in most people's minds between blockchain. Bitcoin is what you immediately think of, and cryptocurrencies. Yes, but how it could be extended into publishing, that segues nicely into Jane. So Jane, welcome, and thanks very much for joining. In your recent article in Logos, which is, for those people who don't know, it's one of the better known journals, academic journals on publishing. In your recent article there, you said that blockchain could create opportunities in 3 broad areas. We've heard Phill talking about the intricacies and complexities of adopting new technologies, but could you explain which areas you think offer the greatest opportunity for blockchain technology and distributed ledger technologies within the publishing industry?
Sure. And just to kind of clarify for the audience, so my target kind of focus in terms of technology and solutions is more around commercial publishing rather than scholarly. That means the sort of books that you buy in a bookshop. And so the kind of solutions that I look at and the different technologies that help with some of the issues we have in our retail publishing industry really do focus on the sort of the consumer end. The 3 kind of main areas that I talked about in my article were really around new business models and distribution, and trying to solve some of the distribution for authors, because right now it's very much in the hands of publishers and fairly limited when it comes to consumer publishing, and the opportunities are fairly limited for authors. So I think everyone thinks that they've got a book in them, but honestly, try and get it published. It's the hardest thing in the world. The second key solution I can really see being helpful, blockchain can be really helpful with, is IP management, asset management, especially around global asset management, where the asset is, or the IP is particularly valuable and sits in many people's hands, and also has the inherent super problem of piracy, which blockchain really, really can help with because of the integrity of the blockchain. And then third, sales production and collaboration processes, which is something that Phill touched on. In terms of kind of rights management, just to talk a little bit more in depth about how blockchain can help solve the solution. A lot of the solutions are not in publishing currently, but in a fairly parallel industry, you can see some brilliant solutions if anybody wants to Google around the music industry. If you have a look at Mycelium, which is a solution that Imogen Heap has created, the creative passport for artists to be able to track the usage of their IP. It's a really interesting movement there. And I think that's something that can be very easily translated into our industry. And at the moment, if you think about what the problem really is for IP management, if I can just, is it okay, Byron, if I just dive in a bit on that? Is that right?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
If you look at something really valuable, like let's say Star Wars, you know, the rights will be residing with film people, game people, merchandisers, Lego. It could be any number of very valuable assets globally. And each of those parties will own some level of rights, but there'll be no interaction as to where the beginning and end of those rights are, because every license will have a term, every license will have a really detailed remit. But all the licensing for those different parts will sit in siloed places. But everybody else will need to know what everyone else's rights are to make sure they don't infringe them. And that in itself just doesn't work. So there's a load of real conflict that happens there. And then you get piracy as well, because of course the IP is valuable. And that for the industry means that everyone spends a huge amount of money on lawyers. Nobody has any visibility. And the rights owner themselves is probably a creative person who needs to have control over their rights and really needs people to act in a way with lots of integrity. And that in itself just doesn't work when you think about the way that we handle rights. And blockchain could be a brilliant solution for that. In the same way that Mycelium does for Creative Passport, anybody who creates something should be able to track it and have some visibility over it. I think the only limiting issue with that is that, of course, then there's money involved, and that's something that nobody ever wants to talk about. They want to talk about what rights they own, but they don't want to talk about how much money they make. So there has to be a way to split two of those things.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, we'll shelve the money question for one moment. But as far as IP management is concerned, that's extremely interesting. I mean, the background that I'm coming from specifically is, of course, academic publishing, scholarly publishing, and you have universities putting together course packs from a variety of different sources, from textbooks, from articles, from journals. And in order to do that, of course, they have to go through a centralized agency such as the Copyright Clearance Center or the CLA. And it's a tremendously complex process, which can slow up the whole business of putting together an integrated course on say Moodle or whatever other learning management system the institution happens to be using for the users or researchers in question. So you, particularly, Jane, must be dealing with some incredibly complex rights issues at the moment across multiple international boundaries, multiple properties.
Yeah.
So can you provide some insights, without giving too much away, on how you think that a blockchain solution or blockchain solution might be able to help in your specific case, which is trade publishing rather than academic?
Yeah. I think it's an interesting question. I think if you were, and it goes back to the question you asked Phill earlier about institutions adopting new technologies as well. I think if you were to ask a publisher, which is how we kind of access creative content and trade, they would say blockchain can't help at all, because they don't want to change the way they do things. They want, and publishers, especially in trade, are very famous for buying software systems that do exactly what the old software system already does, but just cost another couple of million quid that they just want to implement it in. I think the way that I described rights management is a fantastic solution if you are the person that is the IP holder. So if you are the creative person who's created something amazing, Game of Thrones or whatever it is, if you were able to utilize blockchain to track your rights, potentially track the distribution as well, then you don't need a publisher. So of course, when you're trying to sell it to publishers, they're not interested because they want everything to remain the same as it is. So if you're going to ask me about what solutions there are, I would have to come at it from if I was the creative person rather than if I was the publisher. Because I think if I was a publisher, I would say blockchain, a trade publisher, I'd say I can't see how blockchain can help us at all, because they don't want to disintermediate any of their processes as they stand at the moment. If you ask a trade publisher anything, they tell you they want to print in paper only as well. So we're kind of miles behind everyone else. And the only reason we've kind of been forced into digital is because of Amazon, and then audio because of Audible, which of course is an Amazon company really in most of the Western markets. So publishers will only ever innovate or do anything digital, which is still new to us, if they have to. So yeah, so if you come at it from an angle, I can't give you, from a publisher angle, I can't give you any reason to use blockchain whatsoever. From a creative person angle, I can give you every reason, which is to control your rights, which is the key thing that everybody who creates anything should be really, really keen on. And of course, publishers are very keen that they control the rights rather than somebody who's created the content.
Brings to mind Henry Ford's famous quote that when asked whether he had asked the general public whether they wanted a motor car, he said, no, if I asked the general public, they would have said, no, what we want is a faster horse.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
I had an example many years because, you know, we talked about the iPhone earlier, and it really was making me smile about a meeting we had right at the beginning, when right before iPhones were created. I ran a company that was the first mobile content company on mobile phones. And it was in the days when we had the little tiny screens. And I went to a meeting with the CEO of Penguin Random House. And she said to me at the time, no one is ever going to read anything on a mobile phone. And you come to us now, and I actually, what you could say is nobody ever speaks on a phone anymore. Everyone only reads on a phone. So, you know, the trade publishing industry, we are not the innovators. So we have to be forced into it. In the job that I am in currently, luckily I work in an area, particularly because our company is not a publishing company, it's owned by the author. We're owned by somebody who wants to innovate. So I work for a purely digital company. And I think I'm hoping there'll be more companies like us coming up. And hopefully they will also start to think about blockchain solutions for rights management. Our organization, I don't think it's something that we're looking at now, but I think if another company did it and could crack it and started to put their rights on a blockchain, it's certainly something we would look at.
What you said earlier on about it being of increasing importance to the hands of the creator. Of course, one of the things that we're seeing is the emergence of the independent author, the self-published author.
Yes.
Do you think, and this is a sort of off-the-cuff question, but do you think it could be of future importance to those people who are creating their own books, creating their own novels, whatever it might happen to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's only one, I'm trying to think, there's two reasons potentially broadly why you'd need a publisher, and I'm sorry if there's lots of publishers here to say that in trade. One is for marketing launch, and to send you off to a bookstore so you can do your book launch, which of course none of us are allowed to do anymore. And the other is for physical creation and distribution of your book. Now, if the world was entirely digital, you wouldn't particularly need a trade publisher if you were able to find a market and you were good at social media and you were able to launch yourself and somehow get some traction for your books. So self-publishing, I think, as digital grows in trade, will become huge. And I think there will become more established routes to market for getting your book out there, whether it's through TikTok or wherever. And I think at that point, I think, yes, you can get your book out there, but then of course, rights management becomes a big issue. And at that point, blockchain, if there was a ready-made out of the box solution for people like that, then being able to register your IP rights on a blockchain and then hopefully sell globally would be fantastic. And then I think self-publishing, yeah, it could be an absolute case in point for making blockchain more sort of established within the publishing community.
Thanks very much. That's a really interesting viewpoint.
Before you move on, if I can touch on one point that Jane raised, which is to do with publishers feeling that they will be cut out from the process. It's not necessarily the case, although blockchain did come along to cut out the middleman. That is not necessarily the case if we're talking about, depending on the type of blockchain we're talking about. I'm sorry, but there's a thunderstorm happening outside my house. I don't know if you hear the thunders, but it's gone crazy. Because there's also the private and the consortium blockchains, which in fact ensure that the people that have access and the people that form the network are quite controlled. So there's nothing stopping a publisher for accessing a private blockchain or a consortium blockchain where they can more easily manage the records, and they can still offer the security element of what goes on the blockchain to the people that do decide to publish on the blockchain without cutting themselves out from the process. So it all depends on the model that is going to be used for. And other than decentralized blockchains, there's also the public blockchain. There's also the private and consortium blockchains that may solve problems without cutting the publisher, in this case, from the middle.
Well, I think that neatly brings us round to a final round of questions or a final round of comments before we open it up to the floor. We've got a number of questions coming in on the Q&A box. So before we move over to the general questions, I think starting with you, Jane, going back again, any final thoughts on what the future holds for blockchain across the publishing industry based on what people have been saying?
I think the publishing industry, from our perspective in trade, like I said, we're never going to be the innovators, we are the followers. I think we will be looking closely as an industry, or the few people that like to look closely at what's happening in technology and try and bring things in, we'll be looking closely at what the games industry and the music industry is doing, because they're industries that we see ourselves as very much aligned to. And also, of course, we work with very closely. So I think we'll be looking to see what those more technologically advanced partners of ours will be bringing in and probably replicating what they do.
Phil,
any last thoughts?
Not quite the last thoughts, but the penultimate thoughts maybe. So Jane said that trade publishers would, not necessarily be the most innovative of the publishing industry, and I'd say that scholarly publishers similarly have got, for the reasons that I talked about before, around the fact that they're high barriers to entry. It's a very protected industry. So certainly much more the consumer publishing, scholarly publishing has got, is very, very difficult to disrupt. I know this from personal experience, having been the first editorial director at Jove. Trying to disrupt the industry, it's really hard to kind of get in and get involved, because there are so many there are so many things that you have to do, like registering with with PubMed, for example, and becoming registered in journal citation reports and getting in Web of Science. All these things that are necessary are very, very hard and expensive and challenging to do. So it's very well protected. In terms of where the innovation kind of comes into the industry, there are folks who talk about looking at what's going on in other industries, but I don't necessarily think that that's where most of the innovation is kind of coming in. I think it comes in from close adjacencies that are being invested in, and it also comes in through startups and through usually people who are researchers or involved in the academic system who are frustrated with some of the friction that the traditional system kind of creates. So I think that's the place to look for where that innovation is going to happen in scholarly. And as I said before, the way to kind of look at where the value lies is to forget about the name of the technology for a minute, and when somebody is trying to talk about a new and innovative idea, think about the use case and whether it solves an actual problem, from the point of view of helping information flow through academia more efficiently and more quickly, so that we can all sort of add value and accelerate progress.
Great. Let's pass on for a final word before we move on to questions from the floor. From Alexis, any last comments, any last thoughts before we move on?
Yep, definitely. Blockchain, like any other technology, whether it's the internet, whether it's AI, it's got certain characteristics. And even though I'm running a blockchain-based company as a second layer application, it's not for us to come in and force a solution onto the industry, but it's for the industry themselves to appreciate. I think Phill touched upon that, to appreciate the benefits through the characteristics that a technology brings, and whether this is something that solves problems which they, better than anybody else, live day in, day out and witness day in, day out. So we're there to build solutions that would make it easier for publishers, in this case, to have access to blockchain technology. Companies like ours are making it simple for people with zero technical knowledge to get access to this technology, to the benefits that this technology brings. But it's always up to the professionals within the space to understand and to appreciate whether the characteristics of specific technologies do solve some of the pain points they experience. If you allow me, Byron, there's a question I saw in the Q&A just before I close, asking whether to do with the validator that is found on our website, whether somebody can validate a document if our website is down. The validation element has nothing to do with us. We're a completely decentralized offering, in the sense that the validation process does not really involve us. What happens behind the scenes when somebody validates a document, it's the document speaking directly to the blockchain itself. So the match that takes place is the metadata that is embedded within that document that speaks directly to the blockchain. And if there's a perfect match, then the validation comes through as a positive, if not as a negative. So any validator that exists on any of our clients' websites can be used. And we actually sort of put that as an advantage of our offering, in the sense that we could become extinct, and we could disappear, and our technology and whatever has been published through ourselves and will still be there and will still be able to be validated. And that was the initial desire of the University of Nicosia, our founders, that even if they disappear, any documents, any certificates issued to students through the university will be able to be validated in years to come. So that's in reply to one of the questions that was posted as on the Q&A.
Yeah, I think that was the first question that came up. Actually, we've got another number of questions coming in. We've still got time for these. So one for Jane from an anonymous attendee here. On Jane's talk, the publisher will still be needed, the question goes, to enforce rights, to enforce those rights, as enforcing rights can be very expensive. Jane, any comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's true. Absolutely, that's part of a publisher's role. They will only enforce the rights, though, if they have a certain value level. And we talked a little bit earlier about self-publishing and being able to use blockchain to track the IP for your rights. And I think that's when blockchain can become useful, because then you can enforce your own rights, or maybe try and find a way to take down rights of your own, because, as they said, rights can be very expensive. That means that for publishers, enforcing rights can be very expensive. That means for publishers, they can only do it in limited cases. So quite often a publisher will have a third-party legal company, for example, Digimark, or any other sort of third-party legal company that will help check what rights infringement is happening, but they won't always be able to enforce them. But if they're your own rights that you've registered on a blockchain or you're aware of, you will have an inherent need to try and enforce that in some way, or at least contact the person that's breaching your rights. And you'll have obviously some kind of record there that the rights are yours, and you'll be able to show the life cycle of your rights through a blockchain as well. I hope that answers the question.
I'm sure we'll have a comment if it doesn't, but I think that does answer the question. Another question here from Gordon Honeyman. I believe IFF UNIC, that's the University of Nicosia, are looking to expand their tokenization work. Would IPR in publishing or elsewhere be a good opportunity for tokenization? Alexi, one for you, I think.
Well, I'm not really sure, but I would definitely put it to them. I know they are looking for new projects, but it could be an opportunity. The characteristics of the industry definitely fit the profile for tokenization. It's people owning parts of the asset. That's what tokenization does. It enables multiple parties to own part of that asset. I don't know whether the publications industry is something whether people will be willing to sell part of their IP right, but maybe there's other elements to the industry that can be tokenized, that can be that small parts of the total asset can be sold to third parties. I would definitely put that to the IFF and see whether there's any interest.
I look forward to hearing the feedback on that. That should be interesting. Another question from Stefan Kent. I see he says that hybrid blockchains are the way for the future. Are there any thoughts on how to effectively manage the cost of running these? Maybe this is a question for Phill.
Actually, I think that might be more for Alexis, actually, on the hybrid blockchains.
Alexis, you're on mute.
Sorry about that.
That's it.
The cost of running a blockchain is usually shared is pushed down the chain and eventually shared by the participants within the network. So at the end of the day, like any other business, the cost will be shared by the eventual users, the people that actually do get a benefit out of using that particular blockchain. I don't have any other comment on that particular question.
But do you think hybrids are more expensive than public distributed ones? Or because public distributed ones have the problem that they have massive energy consumption, right? And private ones not so much.
Absolutely. Although nowadays most of the energy is produced through green sources, so whether either wind or solar panels, but hybrid blockchains will be you have a cost will be mainly consumed by the consortium, by the parties that actually have make the use of that blockchain. But then again, it's a part of the cost of sales of that particular entity of the companies participating in that consortium. So again, ultimately, the client of those people will be consuming that. Although the use of blockchain has proven to reduce costs, so in effect, it could have a positive impact on the actual sales price of the product of those particular companies. So using a blockchain could reduce costs, whether it's in the supply chain or whatever else, and there could be a positive impact on the end price that the consumer is called to pay.
There's always going to be some kind of trade-off, isn't there? It's a question of compromising offsetting one set of expenditure against another. So yeah. I think we've got time for one more question possibly a couple more questions before we go to a poll. This is from an anonymous attendee, and they say, blockchain is next generation technology. What do you see as the next evolving changes to the technology? Not so much its user cases, as there are many in the industry. It can work, but more in the tech. Is it encryption or something else? Who would like to pick this one up and run with it?
I would say that the major one that the community is striving for is that of interoperability between the various blockchains. That would be a major one once it happens, and there's a lot of work that's taking place there. Scalability is another direction to which the technical developments are going. But I personally feel that interoperability is definitely the most positive development that will happen in the coming years when it comes to blockchain technologies, for different blockchains to be able to communicate between them.
Okay, I wonder if there are any more questions coming in at all. I've just got one. It's purely out of personal interest, and this possibly is one for Alexis again. We've seen some very high-profile acquisitions in publishing, including the recent purchase of Hindawi, major open access publisher, by Wiley for a cool $298 million. When it comes to mergers and acquisitions, how can blockchain help there? Oh, Alexis, you're on mute again.
Sorry, my apologies for that. During my days in the city in London, as a chartered accountant at the time, I did come across quite a few mergers and acquisitions, and in most cases, it was a case of asset valuation. What are you buying into, basically? Is the money you're paying worth what you're getting for? I think the cases you're referring to, Byron, I think we looked at them at some point together. One of them was it the Hindawi one?
Hindawi, yeah.
Yeah, a company that was headquartered in London, which had a portfolio of about 200 peer-reviewed scientific, technical, medical journals, and a highly efficient publishing platform. Now, due diligence there would be involved in both the IT that is underpinning the platform and the copyright of every one of those 200 journals. Even though I think in that case they were open access, so being able to validate the ownership of those assets will be of prime importance. That's the main use of blockchain technology that I could see. I think another one was the Hirewire one that was bought by an Indian company. Ownership of IT software design would have had to be verified in that case. Some of the platform software, some of the IT software was in fact developed by a separate company, which was acquired by the acquired company. So part of the main platform was built on open source software. So in establishing the establishing the value, the importance of who owns which bits and which is open source would definitely make negotiating in that instance of of quite a bit of interest.
Thanks very much. Before we go, and before I thank the panelists and thank everyone for coming along this afternoon, we do have a couple of polls. These will only take a few minutes to answer. Now, bear with me, I've never actually operated a poll on Zoom before, so this should be interesting. I'll launch the first one. So the first poll coming up now, polling number 1, which in your opinion is the strongest user case of blockchain in the publications industry based on your own experience or what you've heard today? And I'm just going to launch the poll now. So I'll leave that up for 45 seconds or so to answer it. That's great. That's very interesting. Well, I'm going to end the polling now. So by far and away, the leader there with 42% is to determine creatorship or proof of ownership. And we had 19 respondents to that one. 42% that was the most important user case of blockchain within publishing. Closely followed on 20% by the decentralized publishing and usage rights. So that was the second most important factor that came out from the session today. And then number 3, to unify a patent system across jurisdictions. 16% went for that one. And then last of all, we had to enable the IP marketplace. Interestingly enough, that was only 9%. And then better collaboration and rights assignments for scholarly journals and articles. We had 7% putting that one into the poll. Okay, now there's polling number 2. So I'll just launch that one. So this is a feedback poll, just to get your feedback before we actually close for the day. So I'll launch this one now. 30 seconds to answer this one. And here we go. Okay, so to question number 1, all of you said that you got a lot of valuable insights out of the session today. So thank you very, very much to our panelists. I think it was a really great session, really interesting. I learned a lot. I'm going to be looking at the recording, which is going to be made available on YouTube. As I was trying to moderate and use the technology myself, I didn't have time to listen to it in great detail. So I should look forward to looking over the whole webinar again at some future stage. Quite a few people, 27% said, I'd like to get more information. We can certainly supply that. So if you contact block.co, then we can give you more information. We can answer any other questions that you may have, and we can provide more detailed information on the use of blockchain in the publishing industry. And then the second polling topic was, what kind of topics would you like us to cover in future webinars? Digital identities streaked ahead of all the others, with 42% wanting another webinar on digital identities. Closely followed, number 2 and number 3, by blockchain in real estate, which is an interesting one. I wouldn't have actually gone there, but yeah, I can see that there could be an interesting an interesting webinar behind that. And 17% on blockchain and insurance. I think the user case there much more self-evident. Right, well, all that remains for me to do is to once again thank the panelists. Thank very much to George Agathangelou again for setting up the technology which enabled us to hold this webinar today, and everything seemed to function very well, certainly better than some of the other Zoom webinars I've been on. So thanks very much, and do enjoy the rest of your week. If you want to get in touch with us about anything at all, then you can contact us via the website. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
And don't forget the certificates that you'll be getting that can be validated on the blockchain.
Very important.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.